The escalating diplomatic pressure surrounding the Ukraine conflict, a comprehensive analysis, a significant and ongoing series of developments continue to unfold in the geopolitical landscape, with a marked increase in diplomatic pressure concerning the conflict in Ukraine. At present, the negotiations between Russia and Ukraine appear to be hanging by a thread, while a clear pattern of escalation is emerging across Europe. Simultaneously, the presidents of Russia and the United States seems to be engaged in urgent efforts to prevent the situation from spiraling entirely out of control. President Zelensky's stance and the Istanbul negotiations. To begin with, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has publicly declared that the memorandum presented by Russia during the recent talks in Istanbul was entirely unacceptable. He has asserted that further negotiations in the current format would be futile, emphasizing that the only viable discussions would be direct talks between himself and Russian President Vladimir Putin. In other words, Zelensky is once again demanding a one-on-one meeting with Putin, though there are indications from Ukrainian sources that he may also seek the involvement of former U.S. President Donald Trump. However, it remains unclear whether Trump is willing to participate, and Putin has shown no interest in such format. If Zelensky's statements are taken at face value, they suggest that Ukraine is prepared to withdraw from the Istanbul negotiations entirely. This would effectively bring the Istanbul process to an abrupt halt with Zelensky, rather than Russia being the party responsible for its collapse. Yesterday, I noted that President Putin appeared to be nearing the limits of his patience with Ukraine's conduct. However, other Russian officials, including Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and Chief Negotiator Vladimir Medinsky, still seem to believe that continuing the Istanbul talks held some value. Before concluding yesterday's meeting in Moscow, Putin indicated that he would hold further discussions with Lavrov and Medinsky to determine whether Russia should formally exit the negotiations. Zelensky, however, appears to have preempted this decision by all but declaring Ukraine's withdrawal from the Istanbul format. Of course, this is Zelensky's stated position. If the United States were to insist that he participate or at least send representatives, he might backtrack, as he has done on previous occasions. For now, however, he seems intent on terminating the Istanbul process, doing so before Putin has made any formal announcement on the matter. Escalations from Germany, the Taurus missile controversy. Another critical aspect of the current escalation stems from Germany. Defense Minister Boris Pistorius has made aggressive statements, claiming that Ukraine is on the verge of deploying long-range weapons developed with German assistance, which will reportedly become operational within days. If these weapons are missiles, it raises serious questions. While it is conceivable that Germany has been aiding Ukraine in manufacturing long-range missiles, it is difficult to imagine this production occurring within Ukraine itself more likely. It would take place in Germany. Any decision to co-produce such missiles would have had to be made during Olaf Scholz's chancellorship, and the most plausible candidate would be the Taurus cruise missile, Germany's only long-range cruise missile system. A simpler explanation, however, is that Taurus missiles have already been delivered to Ukraine, and the narrative of local production is a smokescreen to circumvent legal and political restrictions. Unless one believes that Scholz authorized missile productions on Ukrainian soil, or that Pistorius and the German defense establishment acted behind Scholz's back, the only logical conclusion is that these are indeed Taurus missiles, possibly delivered in a prefabricated state and reassembled in Ukraine. This convoluted approach appears to be an attempt to bypass German law, deceive the public, and obscure the reality from Russia's, though it is unlikely that any of these parties are truly fooled. Adding to the complexity, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz is en route to the United States. The Taurus missile relies on U.S. provide targeting data for strikes on Russian territory. Thus, its GPS guidance does not function over Russia. Additionally, the missile reportedly contained U.S. military components that restrict its use without explicit American approval. Connecting these dots, it seems plausible that Pistorius' announcement signals an expectation that Merz will secure Trump's approval for the deployment of Taurus missiles against Russia, an extraordinary escalation that must have been planned well in advance. U.S. hardliners and coordinate escalation. The push for escalation is not limited to Germany. In the United States, Senator Richard Blumenthal and Lindsey Graham have been touring Europe, making belligerent statements about imposing further sanctions, ostensibly targeting China, though framed as measures to pressure Russia. They argue that more forceful actions are needed to compel Russia to negotiate, implying that Trump's diplomatic efforts have been insufficient. Blumenthal and Graham are now preparing to introduce a bill in the Senate next week, which they claim will receive overwhelming support. Their rhetoric suggests coordination with European hardliners, possibly including figures within the Trump administration, such as General Keith Kellogg. The broader pattern of escalation. The current trajectory is unmistakable. Ukraine has intensified attacks on Russian territory, including drone strikes on airbase, railway sabotage in western Russia, and assault on Crimea and occupied regions like Zaporizhia and Kherson. Germany appears poised to facilitate long-range missile strikes against Russia. U.S. hardliners are advocating for crippling sanctions and further militarizations of the conflict. Yet, resistance to this escalation exists. Some European nations have hesitated to impose additional sanctions, and the U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has notably avoided the Ramstein summit, aligning with Trump's gradual disengagement from military support for Ukraine. Additionally, the U.S. has not endorsed British and European proposals to tighten the oil price cap on Russian crude. Putin and Trump's diplomatic efforts. Amid this turmoil, Putin and Trump are working to de-escalate. Following their recent phone call, reportedly lasting 70 minutes, Kremlin aide Yuri Yushakov provided detailed accounts. Putin emphasized that Ukraine's attack on civilian targets constitute terrorism under international law, with the Kyiv regime effectively degenerating into a terrorist organization. Istanbul talks. Despite Ukrainian provocations, Russia did not abandon negotiations, viewing the talks as productive, particularly on prisoner exchange. Airfield strikes. Trump reiterated that the U.S. had no prior knowledge of Ukraine's attack on Russian airbase, a claim met with skepticism but significant given the backlash within the MAGA movement. Former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn and others have condemned the airfield strikes, noting that Russia's strategic bombers were vulnerable due to long-standing U.S. Russian confidence building measure. The attack, they argued, not only targeted Russia but undermined U.S. security by risking nuclear escalation. Conclusion: a precarious balance. The situation remains perilously balanced. Hardliners in Ukraine, Europe, and the U.S. are pushing for total escalation. Putin and Trump are striving to sustain diplomatic channels, with Trump's likely to oppose Graham and Blumenthal's sanctions. The upcoming Trump-Merz meeting will be pivotal. If Trump refuses to authorize Taurus strikes, a confrontation with Germany is possible. Meanwhile, Ukraine's military situation deteriorates, with German Defense Minister Pistorius admitting that Germany has already transferred a quarter of its air defense missiles to Ukraine and cannot provide more. Europe's insistence on escalation defies rationality, particularly for Germany, whose historical and economic ties with Russia make confrontation especially perilous. Yet, as the adage goes, those whom the gods wish to destroy, they first make mad. Europe appears to be collectively succumbing to this madness, with the US serving as the only potential counterbalance. As events unfold, the world watch to see whether diplomacy can prevail or whether the conflict will plunge into even greater chaos.